Greetings and welcome once again to Aspects of Aliyah. Today we're going to have our second consideration of the Deluge. And in the UK at the moment, as we're speaking, we're having a deluge of almost biblical proportions here. However, let's just take that as a little affirmation of what we're going to speak about today. So we gave the general background in our teaching on Nephilim in series 1. Then we did the second one, we looked at who Noach was and various things. And then we more or less jumped through to the conclusions. So our first session today is what I'm going to call the fill-ins. As we said, the story of Noach and his ark is probably one of the most well-known stories in the world. We've seen it was known almost in a universal sense, but generally in different geopolitical identities, such as the record of something similar in China and in India. By and large, these Deluge narratives came before literacy. They came when the world was very small, where social mobility, believe it or not, was maybe 2 to 3 miles, maybe 6 at the most in desert areas, and the traditions were handed down. So that's just a little recap. So I thought we might start just to expand this, because the stories are interesting and the conclusions are not particularly large, because in all these things we're looking at the main thrust of scripture, which is a 3-stranded cord: God, land, and people. Okay, so we know that land is defiled by the behaviour of those living on it. We looked at all these quite fantastic creatures and people and their wickedness, so God passes his judgment. So I found that was just useful, even though in one sense it's not all that essential to our conversations we're talking about, but just to embroider and broaden it out. You see, one of my big problems over my years in ministry, which I'm guessing now is 40-ish, I'm appalled by the fact that people don't read the scriptures. Or if they do read them, they read them with what Rudolf Bultmann called a pre-understanding. If we think we understand the context before we read it, we don't read the words, the syntax, the grammar, the etymology. We don't read any of those things at all. What we actually do effectively is we approach it with what we call a pre-understanding. We think we know this, so we skim read it. We know all this, we just run over the words. But a little bit of deep mining, as it's sometimes called, is worth the exercise. So what I want to do before the break is have a look at the timeline of the events. Not that it's particularly essential for our we say, our ethos, that we have to be good readers, and understanders, and maybe some could be scholars of biblical text. So, we're going to start off with the timeline of the event. So, we looked at poor old Noah, spending 120 years building the ark, and it's quite interesting that Methuselah, his grandfather, died apparently on the day the project was completed. So the flood begins 7 days after the announcement by God. It lasts for 40 days and 40 nights. That's 6, 4, and 12. Now, 40 days and 40 nights, as we said, does not necessarily have to be understood as 40 days and nights as we understand them. It's a long time. And 40 days and 40 nights is generally, right throughout the scriptures, a symbolic number for 2 reasons. Firstly, expressing a very long time, but 40 is also the number for a generation. A generation is going to be 40 years. So it lasted for a generation. So then the rain ceases after 50 days, depending how you read the text. Then after 7 days, during which the waters begin to decrease, 838, Noah sends out the first dove. After another 7 days, another dove. After another 7 days, a third dove is dispatched. Now, you're going to say to me, what about the raven? Well, the raven is interesting from 2 points of view. One was a symbolic thing that we're not going to detain ourselves with. But if we translate some of the Hebraic idioms and things, we could translate it like this. He sent it out and it flapped about, did nothing and came back. It went out on, can we call it a fool's errand? Okay. But the doves are the essential elements. The 3 of them. The first one, nothing. The second one, an olive branch. And then thirdly, he doesn't return. So, now it takes this to mean it's possible now that the deluge and the effects of it are now finished. So then, it's quite interesting language. It says he uncovers the ark. I think the word, which is, I'm not going to bore with it, but in Hebrew, it could even be translated as unhinged, but in today's parlance, it's literally, we could probably say pull the tarpaulin back or something like that. And then, wow, the face of the earth is showing signs of dryness. Although, it also says in the text, they were still wet and took more time to literally dry off. Noah then disembarks and offers a sacrifice, which the description recalls vividly the synoptic accounts from other regions. And the account, interestingly, mentions 7 days of preparation, 6 or 7 depending on the manuscript, days of storm, and 7 days of waiting for after the flood storm. So it seems while it was drying out, it might still be a little bit stormy. So when we get, as we move on, the gradual subsidence is described in chapter 8. It tells the waters had risen 15 cubits above the highest mountain peaks. Wow. So if a cubit is 18 inches or a foot and a half, in our terms, it's quite easy to work out what that is, isn't it? But the interesting thing here is as soon as the waters begin to subside, they are grounded. So rain, wind, etc. And then suddenly the ark's grounded. So it tells us when the storm ceased, God sent the wind to move it out. Then suddenly, this is interesting, no details. It tells us as soon as waters began to subside, out grounded on one of the mountains in the land of Ararat. So, if you want to look at the linguistics of this, Araratu in the Assyrians is probably the equivalent in the Babylonian account of where the ship comes to rest. So, did it land on Mount Ararat or in Mount Judi in Kurdistan or somewhere south west of Lake Van? Geographical details are a bit vague. As I said many times, geography, political identities change frequently throughout the historical process. So sufficient to say, we have a timeline of all these kind of things, all of which are significant, all which talk about generations, talk about 700 members of perfection in human writing. All these numbers are significant. So, how high was this? How dry was it? Well, it's always going to be a matter of speculation. And as I did my study to prepare not just for this, but for my history of Israel as the anthropological element of a systematic ecology for Israel, I found this very important. Not just because the Deluge narrative appears all over the place in the ancient world, but because of the specificity of the Hebraic one, which is the only one that is built on what I'm going to call transitional morals and ethics. Morals that started in Den, God, land, and people, passed through the Cain cycle, came into the time of the Nephilim, the Gibborim, comes towards Noach, comes towards the Deluge, this long continuing line of consistency. So I'm going to suggest that a lot of the technical details in themselves are not really that important because etiological histories try and explain the unknown matter that deal with life, death, family, faith, and policy. This is how we need to view these things. So in one sense, some of the details aren't that important. The details in the time on this narrative are. So I hope you've picked this up. 120, which you're going to find later, comes up. 120 years for the construction of the ark. Man's lifetime is restricted to 120 years as we go on along. So it's interesting to me personally anyway, that the ark grounded on the very day that the waters began to subside, which if they I try to avoid these things like the plague. There's so much written about the deluge. We've got scientists, engineers, geologists, meteorologists. It's almost like you've got a mad meeting of ideas and different. Some people think that the physical, geographical, scientific, navigational, you name it. And there's countless papers about all these things. I just wanted to say to you, take these things the way the narrator presented them. He wanted to say that when humanity falls, God needs to recreate, which is the essence of this etiological narrative. Anyway, just to keep us amused and perhaps what might be a reasonable comment, shall we say. The narrator makes an assumption within the text. And he assumes that 30 cubits of the ark's height, 45 feet, if you want, 15 of those, half of them would be in the water for the draft. In this, he differs from Babylonian accounts on this. My question is, does it really matter about these things? No. But I think the thing that is interesting is if you look at the construction of the ark, what we're actually looking at. I mean, ark simply means box or container, something like that, as in the Ark of the Covenant. However, if we look into ancient history and if we look at vessels and things that would actually stay in the water, it becomes quite interesting. So we'll look at that in a minute.
As a musician, I can tell you that timing is everything. The beat of the drum, the pluck of the strings, the tinkling of the ivories, or the strum of the guitar. If you want the music to sound right, then you have to play in time. And if you're joining with others, everyone needs to play at the right moment. You know, it's the same with what God is doing. Our Creator is playing a melody, and the theme of the song is protecting His children. But like any orchestra, it's important that as we join in, that we too get the timing right. You see, timing is everything. And now is the time to become part of the orchestra that God is assembling. Our God-given purpose is to support and stand with the Jewish people. This is the greatest song you could ever sing and the greatest music you could ever play. Won't you join with the band with Ezra International as we join with what God is doing? Remember, timing is everything, and that time is now.
Welcome back. Well, I start looking at the ark and its construction, and is there any real theological value in this? Does it say anything to us? Does it tell anything to us? And I've read so many articles, I've not known whether to laugh or cry. Read some of them. It was a prototype of a cargo ship. Really? Huh? It was this kind of ancient ship. No. This goes back well than that. It just tells us the container. And quite frankly, if you look at those dimensions, what we're looking at is something like a massive coracle with a tarpaulin on the top of it. It'd been huge, but there was no shipbuilding technology in those days. So please, spare me and all of us from shipwrights, looking at this from a 20th century perspective, from ancient historians looking for something in their time frame that's much later, and let's just take it in its sense. A vessel was constructed to save humanity, or a remnant. And the element of a righteous remnant runs right through the three-stranded cord when we think about it, doesn't it? The narrative. Disaster. But then we get Seth. And then we're going to Cain, etc. Another disaster. But there is still a remnant from Seth. And through all these 10 generations leading up to Noah, there is a righteous remnant, but it's just a category of ongoing disaster. So, when we look at the ark and all these kind of things, it's very important for us, isn't it? Because in real terms, it's about God keeping or retaining a remnant of humanity for Himself. So when we pursue these things, shall we say, a little bit further, where do we looked at the previous things that match with it in the ancient world, but does this have any originality about it? And the answer is yes, it is, because notice could be illustrated by a very careful study of the Hebrew text, as well as archaeological and literary studies over the last couple hundred years, that we've got a very clearly defined line of transmission. And that is most, because what is God's trying to say to us about this? That's the thing that we really need to know. So, the Hebrew word for ark, which I won't bore you with, is of disputed origin. In the Septuagint, it's Kyrios in the Septuagint as area, which is a bit old, isn't it? However, we looked at it, didn't we? And the length is meant to be this massive construction, which in one sense is illustrated in art, literature, and even ancient Hebraic thought as this massive containment to remnant of a destroyed humanity, a return to the chaos in the water, and revival of humanity and the created order. Well, what about the animals that went in there? So let's say straight away that amphibians and aquatic mammals and fish and everything else that lives in water would have survived this, so we forget about them. Birds, some could have perched on top, etc. They'll detect those in the ark. But I think the thing that's interesting for me is there were two categories. There were clean animals and unclean animals, or clean and unclean creatures of the defensive categories that went in. So I've read some absolutely wonderful science fiction accounts of this from serious scholars. I mean, from the Southern Baptist, for instance, and from various Bible colleges, and they're talking about dinosaurs on the ark, and how it must have been. I mean, it's ridiculous. The text is simply saying, in the ark there were the kinds or types that were representative of every living creature. Can we not just leave it at that? Why were there 7 kinds of clean animals as opposed to unclean animals? Simply so sacrifices could have been made during the proposed journey. Very straightforward, very simple. But I've seen these films, and particularly on American TV, friends to America, all these thousands types of animals boarding this primitive. It's a primitive vessel. I mean, looking at a fleet of cargo ships, according to some people. Can we just content ourselves to say that God in His grace and mercy reserved a family for Himself with the children to repopulate the area that He considered to be the land where He would represent Himself? Remember, I said this before, when I talk about Jewish people, we use this term chosen, but representative is better. God took this bid for Himself to represent His goodness, His mercy, but also His justice and His righteousness. So, the deluge destroys the area and the people who were supposed to represent Him. In His goodness, grace, and mercy, He preserves the 10th generation descendant of Adam and his 3 sons. It's rather interesting. We don't really know. There's really considered Lamech the second, Noah's father, because there's 2 Lamechs, and in theology and history, Noah's father is referred to as Lamech the second. As we know, Methuselah died on the day No means the Ark and Deluge. We're not entirely sure with Lamech. If I had the time, I suppose I could work it out mathematically, but you please excuse me for not doing so. So let's just press on a little bit with this. It's a facile exercise to try and enumerate the animals and the types and everything in such a way is a facile experiment to try and look at the maritime structure, the engineering aspects of the Ark. The exponential narrative is telling us that God provided a container, and that's the best way to translate it. God provided a container for a remnant. And let's remember those most fantastic words in the scripture. Right? A remnant will remain. And basically, the story of the Deluge is simply that a remnant will remain. Because God, in his mercy, looked down and saw the effects of free will. He saw the effects of the degradation of his creation. So, what about the survivors? So, we get to chapter 8, they get off the Ark, and Noah prepares, and it's interesting, he prepares and he offers a sacrifice. And then receives the instructions on the sacredness of life and beast, and so on. So we find during the survival narrative a making of a covenant, of which the sign was God's bow or rainbow, 817. Now there's a division of opinion as the employment of rainbow as a sign of covenant. Some of the first critical scholars in the 19th century defended the statement of the author, which implies that previously there had not been such a thing as a rainbow. This was a completely new thing. Obviously, science would deny that. However, a better suggestion is that the rainbow was adopted by God, something existing, something they could see, as a permanent reminder that it would no longer destroy the earth by water. So that really brings us to where we're going to go next. Or should I say, our next session. Because we need to see what was shall we call it the end game? And all this? And what it really was about. But before we go there, just as a last minute or last thought, the Deluge might be one of the most important things in the theological history of the world, not only in the three Abrahamic faiths, but also, as we said earlier, in others and in many different cultures. However, when we think of current Middle East conflict, let's just take our last minute looking at Islamic literature. In the Quran, Noah is mentioned no less than 11 times. The Quranic term for the flood, Tufan, is very similar to the Aramaic term for it. And this leads on to infer that Muhammad had probably heard the story from Jews or Christians in Syria, or probably from both. The most concise, accurate account is given in Surah 29, in verse 14. It says, we sent Hereforto, of translation, Noach to his people, he remained with them for 1,000 years, say 50. Then the flood seized them while they were acting wickedly. But we rescued him and those who were in the ark, and we made it a sign to all creatures. So if you read that, that is not a Hebrew or a Greek text, but it is a take of the account in Jewish Maggdah. So Muhammad took that not from scripture, as we call it, but from Maggdah. So this just illustrates how important these things are. So next session, we're going to talk about the consequences for mankind and God's relationship with mankind after the flood, which I personally think is the most important of these. So, God be with you until we meet again.